Hello everyone, I'm Leah Boleto and I'm in for Neil Patterson today on the Sky News Daily podcast, and we're talking about what's gone wrong with Britain's sewage systems. And I never thought I'd get this excited about talking about poo and wee and the history of the pipes under London and in the entire country actually.
Well, it's hard to describe how it smells. Very, very bad, like kind of the worst lavatory you've ever been to.
But here we are because we've done some number crunching, and the reason we're going to be talking about this, it is a big problem. The Environment Agency, their figures showing that 300,000 sewage spills happened in England. That was just last year. So that's 824 a day. And then on top of that, Water UK says around £10 billion is needed to upgrade the system. And where will that hit? Will it hit our bills? And we're going to be talking all about this with our wonderful economics and data editor. It's Ed Conway, because Ed, you literally went down the drains to really discover the bones of this story.
I went there.
You did, and you recovered, and you're here to talk about it today. This one problem that we're suffering today is actually linked back to the Victorian era. Tell us about the history first.
I'm kind of an economics guy, so in some ways I guess I'm a strange person to be talking about this. It's water. But actually there's this kind of economic idea that people talk about quite a bit in my world of path dependency. Basically, you can take a decision long ago, or someone takes a decision long ago, and it kind of traps you in a certain kind of lane that's very difficult to get out of. 150 years ago, and it's relevant that it's London here, London was mired in what people called miasma. There was sewage everywhere. It was running into the kind of tributaries of the Thames, into the river itself. It got so stinky a few years after that, I think 1858, the sitting of Parliament had to be cancelled because there was so much noxious vapour and smell coming up from the river because of all the sewage that had gone down there. And all the MPs got terrified about it, and they thought, well, something has to be done. At this period, you had a lot of people saying, OK, well, here's the various systems. You know, this is kind of before you really had sewage systems as we know them. And they had lots of different reformers saying, well, here are the various different systems we could install that's going to kind of deal with all of this. And there was one person who was called Edwin Chadwick, who was a great social reformer. He kind of reformed the poor law. He got lots of people out of workhouses. And he said, OK, you need to take all of the sewage and put it down one pipe, and they needed to take the rainwater and put it down a totally separate pipe. And that seemed like kind of sensible thing. But in the event, that wasn't the plan that kind of won out. So the plan that was held by a guy called Sir Joseph Bazalgette. Now, Bazalgette was the man who is still remembered today as the father of Britain's sewage systems, of certainly London's sewage systems. And his idea for the sewage system was something else. His idea was, instead of putting it down two separate pipes, rainwater down one and sewage down another, you just put it all down one massive pipe. So everything is going down the same pipe. And it was, the merit of his system was basically it was cheaper and it was easier. However, the problem with that kind of a system is when there's lots of rain, you will always get sewage overflowing. We chose the Bazalgette system, and in some senses it was a great triumph because the upshot of all of this was that London had a much healthier system than it did before. It had a sewage system. There was nothing to start off with, so you were starting from scratch. So, you know, Bazalgette is a hero in one sense. London was saved from cholera, and many other cities around the world. What London did, everyone else followed. So, you know, around England, around Scotland, Northern Ireland, so on, and Wales, all around the world, everyone was like, well, look, let's copy it. So lots of America has a combined system as well. And these days, everyone's saying, well, what you really need is a separate system where you have one pipe for rainwater and one pipe for sewage. Well, that was the system that Edwin Chadwick and a few other people were recommending 150 years ago. We chose the wrong one. It's too late at this point, because to go back and to turf up all of the pipes that we've got, which are slightly the wrong configuration, would cost maybe £600 billion. That's like 6 HS2s. And so we are stuck with this system.
One decision by one man a century and a half ago means today we've got big problems. Just describe to me the scale of the problem.
I've spent the last few months really making a film.
The story of water is really the story of pipes, their shape, their design, where they go and what they carry, their past.
The scary thing that I found in kind of researching this is, like, as someone who's kind of into data, I wanted to start with what is the definitive measure of, you know, how much we're actually spilling. And we're starting to kind of get data on that for England. But in other parts of the country, for instance in Scotland, there's very little data on it because they've only recently started collecting this stuff. And I asked DEFRA, Water UK, who's the lobby group for the water companies, I asked various water companies, can you direct me towards a model town which has this perfect water system, this nirvana for water, so we can go and film there and show how it's supposed to be done? And literally someone within government said there is no model sewage town, not just in England, in the whole of the UK, which I found flabbergasting. But what's doubly flabbergasting, okay, is that in many parts of Europe, they have a similar system to us. They don't know where the sewage is coming out. It's a total mystery what is underground underneath our feet. And this is scarily commonplace within the water industry. You know, it's that out of sight, out of mind thing. But even here, there is no map of the sewage system. Part of the big sewage overflow plan is to draw up a map. Unfortunately, the upshot of all of this, though, is that if you're looking for a quick fix, there is no quick fix. We're going to be dealing with this not just for years, but probably for decades.
So in your reporting, Ed, at which point in history were we able to make improvements?
In practice, like our consciousness about what's acceptable here and our understanding, I guess, as well, about the dangers of what this pollution can do, that's been evolving over time. So like back in Bazalgette's era, they just dumped it into the river. It was just that they dumped it a bit further away from London and everyone seemed just fine about it. But actually, scientists at the time were like, well, once it goes in the river, it's all kind of organic and it all just does something and it'll be fine. That obviously is no longer the way that scientists kind of view things. But even up until 1998, the sewage that was getting processed at Beckton, the place I visited in the piece, the raw sludge at the end of it was taken on a barge out into the North Sea and dumped. Only as public consciousness has changed have people become more concerned about this kind of thing. And so the recent outcry about sewage, it's not necessarily because we're doing more of it than ever before. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is a serious problem with sewage spills in this country. We have way too many of them, and actually that's one thing everyone can agree on. It is just outrageous and it's unacceptable. Even the water companies kind of hold their hands up to that. Whether they do anything about it is another question. What's happened recently is, you know, people have, maybe it's kind of post-pandemic, you know, there's a lot more people wild swimming, people are reconnecting with nature, they're realising the scale of this kind of thing. And at the same time, the infrastructure has, over time, is struggling.
I'm glad you said that, because its investment was a really big issue by the water companies when they had this, you know, it was privatised. And that's where an issue was. From the 90s, Ed, let's talk about that, because you had a really interesting economist in the piece that was talking about how the water companies were handling it.
Dieter Helm, he's kind of a legend when it comes to looking at infrastructure, stuff like this, the nuts and bolts of the economy and, you know, why it matters and how much it costs. And it's a very complicated kind of sector. You know, his point essentially has been that in the 90s, even before, well, especially before, you know, when it was a national system, the government basically didn't invest enough. And then, you know, part of the point of privatisation was that the private sector would be able to bring in more money to spend on the system. That was the idea, but in practice, you know, it was a very different story.
What effectively the new owners of the companies did was to say, look, we can mortgage these assets. We can go to the bank and say, how much will you lend us against these assets? But then they distributed that money in the form of dividends to shareholders. So here we are, 30-something years later, no new reservoirs have been built, no new resources are in place, and frankly, the state of the sewers is not fit for purpose.
So what about the government then? What are they saying?
Part of what makes this a frustrating thing to cover is that there's so many different kind of responsible people. So you've got the government, obviously, and there's DEFRA within government. They're the people in charge here, technically in charge. You've got the Environment Agency, and they're monitoring the spills and so on that we're seeing, and they're supposed to be looking at the quality of our river water and seawater and so on. You've got Ofwat, who are looking at the management, the kind of financial management mostly, but it's supposed to be the other kind of management. You know, are they investing enough in these companies? And this only is obviously England, and then it's a different story, simpler story in those other parts of the UK where it's a nationalised system, but nonetheless, you have separate regulators like SEPA in Scotland. So it's a bit of a kind of morass of responsibility, and it's never entirely sure who's in control. And I think that is part of the issue. Where does the buck stop? It's certainly the case. When you look at the chart of investment, there was definitely a bit of a leap up from the kind of this is again for England. There was a bit of a leap up from pre-privatisation to post-privatisation. But the line of how much these places are investing each year, it's kind of basically been pretty flat. It's not like you look at that line and say, here was a moment where people saw that a massive slug of money needed to be spent on the system, so in it all went and they kind of did a massive revamp. It wasn't really like that. It was just this constant, quite straight line, which to me speaks of incremental investments, just improving pipe work, improving systems a little bit along the way. Nothing that bespeaks, you know, people coming to this system which may not be fit for purpose and saying to themselves, right, we need to really just kind of revamp this completely. That might be now starting to happen. The problem is, of course, who ends up paying that? Well, it's bill payers that end up paying that, and it will be expensive. And everyone kind of knows that bills are going to go up probably quite a lot. No one wants to talk about it within the water industry. The government doesn't want to talk about it. I interviewed Therese Coffey, the Secretary of State for the Environment and all of these different issues.
I know that we have the best drinking water in the world. I know that we have seen the cleanliness of our beaches and our bathing waters increase significantly since 2010. Of course, I think of the work that we have done unveiling aspects of the scale of the sewage scandal has only...
It's a scandal, is it?
Well, it's under criminal investigation.
She basically signalled that bills will go up, but by the same token, she kind of said something strange along the lines of, well, no one should be having to pay extra bills for something that should have been invested in long ago. Well, that's kind of the point. It should be pretty simple what water companies do. They bring you water, and then they take away your wastewater. And instead what we're left with is a really knotty, tricky, seemingly insurmountable problem. And that's on top of all of the other kind of long-standing big investment quandaries we have in this country. You know, what are we going to do about transport now? HS2 is being kind of part cancelled. What are we going to do about climate change and net zero? These are massive, momentous things that we need to spend, you know, hundreds of billions potentially of pounds on. And then on top of this, you've got water, and it's much less sexy, despite you and I quite enjoying the topic. And no one wants to pay that much extra for something which won't necessarily massively enhance their standard of living. And as far as most people are concerned, you flush the loo and it's done. And you don't have to think any more about it. But the issue is what happens after you flush the loo. And that's kind of what has shocked me, the scale of the problems down the pipes.
After the break, find out what actually happens when you flush the loo. Talk to me about going down the pipes, Ed, because that was a brave choice. But you had to really place yourself in the story here. But talk to me, first of all, about the Beckton sewage treatment works, because once you do flush the loo, 6 hours later, it is actually in Beckton, if you're in central London.
I met it. I
met
it 6 hours later.
What was it like? What did it smell like?
It was awful. Well, it's hard to describe how it smells. Very, very bad, like kind of the worst lavatory you've ever been to. And there's little bits of plastic. There are wet wipes and sanitary towels and all sorts of other things. A moment ago, we saw a dead rat in here. It was just everything you'd imagine it would be, really. There's different, what they called screening places. They're filtering out the nasty stuff that arrives, the big stuff, the plastics. There's like shopping trolleys, pieces of cars, apparently, sometimes human remains. There's grim stuff that's not sewage, actually, that gets filtered out at that point. That was the most smelly bit of all. We kind of went down there, like I had high expectations and from the aroma register. I knew it was going to be an intense experience. And actually, most of it was kind of all right, you know, even the bit, there's a part in the film where we're standing on top of these churning brown kind of liquid pools where basically all the kind of nasty stuff is bubbled away. And actually, it didn't really smell that bad. It smelled a bit bad, but, you know, that's just like a slightly dirty loo. Whereas, that bit at the start where they're filtering out all of the gross stuff. It was one of the worst places. I want to put this in perspective. You know, this is not a dangerous place, and my colleagues go to far greater danger, and indeed are right now doing this stuff. Indeed, by the way, there is a whole piece to be made about sewage in Gaza. The sanitary system that you have in Gaza right now is not dissimilar to the sanitary system that you had in London pre-1856, where basically a lot of the sewage is just being poured down into the water table and then is being drained back up as drinking water. So a lot of people get sick kind of time and time again. So they have a kind of Victorian era sewage system. And so it's tragic alongside the many other kind of tragedies that are happening there. So these places are not places you'd want to visit, but it is a critical part of how we survive as a civilization is having these places so that we don't have to think about our muck, so that we can kind of get it sent away. But that's the problem. I think that because we haven't perhaps scrutinised what happens after you flush that chain and where it all goes, maybe that's part of the explanation for why up until now there wasn't more kind of heat on these companies to spend more and deal with it.
Despite the problems that we currently face with Britain's sewage system, were you impressed by what was happening down at Beckton?
It's pretty advanced. When Beckton was originally set up, that was part of Bazalgette's Victorian kind of vision. And actually some of the stuff they do there to treat sewage was also kind of world leading. And it's state of the art now. So they take the poo and wee and all the other stuff, and amongst other things, they've got these kind of anaerobic digesters which take the methane out of it and then use that basically to run turbines to power the plant. So the place, and the place sometimes generates more power than it actually uses. So it is a power generator, so it's poo power. Poo is being used to generate power. So that's kind of amazing, as is the fact that when that sludge, the solid waste, shall we say, is dealt with at the end, it gets turned into something they call cake.
If we describe it, it's like a black grey,
black, slightly
like
crumbly.
Almost looked like kinetic sand to me, but you were holding it in your hand.
It is a bit like that. It is a bit like kinetic sand. I did not hold it with my bare hands, so I couldn't tell you, because essentially this began its life coming out of someone's bottom. So I was a little bit careful about that. However, this cake, so it's the final bit of sludge that they've kind of processed. That's fertiliser. So it's got lots of nitrogen, it's got lots of other good things that you put into the soil, and it's an organic fertiliser because it's not created from a kind of chemical process. And so this is the stuff that later goes on to fertilise what you eat. So what comes out of your bottom eventually becomes part of what you will go on to eat, which might, for the squeamish, not be a very pleasant thing to hear. But it is, it's an example of actually how it should be done right. We were quite advanced for quite a long time at inventing a lot of this stuff, at being kind of front of the pack when it came to sewage technology and treatment technology. But now a lot of that stuff, the interesting stuff, is happening elsewhere. And part of this film, I go and visit Copenhagen in Denmark, where they are doing things that are much more advanced when it comes to try and deal with their water system. They had floods a few years ago, so there was a kind of also a different level of kind of concern and urgency that led to their reforms. But for instance, in Copenhagen, we started talking out about how ideally you wouldn't put everything down one pipe and ideally you put it into two pipes. In Copenhagen, they're experimenting with putting it into three pipes. So you've got one pipe for roof water, I think it is, another pipe for road water, because that's a little bit dirtier, and then another pipe for the sewage. And they've got car parks where the water, rather than just going kind of off the concrete into the drains, you've got this kind of absorbent asphalt.
Yes, I love that.
Isn't that amazing? And it just allows the water to kind of pass straight through it, and then you end up without it draining into the system. That's the other big problem that all of these cities and towns around the world are facing right now, which is that as we get bigger, the area of concrete that we're covering gets bigger and bigger, and that concrete obviously is not porous, and so it just collects water. It creates this massive catchment area, and so the catchment area is bigger, the water just flows even faster, and you get more floods. And so having car parks that turn out to have absorbent asphalt is a really big deal.
Why are the UK not looking at these innovative projects and thinking, hang on a second, can we not adapt?
Yeah, they are a bit. No one has been especially keen to pay more for their water bills. And, think about it right now. We're having to pay so much more for our energy bills than we're used to. Do you really want to have to pay more for your water bills for some imperceptible improvement that you may never see if you don't actually go wild swimming or anything like that? It's possibly a harder sell, and they can't kind of blame, high prices in Ukraine or anything like that. it's one of those crises that it's easy to try and ignore until it kind of bites you. But I fear that, you know, the less we kind of focus on this, the more crises there are going to be in future. One definite issue is the way that privatisation has been managed. These companies have been able to borrow a lot of money. They've been able to give dividends back to their shareholders. A lot of that money that has been borrowed and was given back in dividends, you know, you just wonder whether that could have been spent on investments and would have made the system better in the long run, and that we wouldn't have the problems that we have now.
What do you make of the new projects here in the UK? Because you went down to that new tunnel that's being built.
Yeah, Tideway.
Also, Tideway. Is that hopeful?
I like big infrastructure projects, I cannot lie. And so going down one of the biggest tunnels we've ever built in this country, and it's massive, it's enormous, and you're way underneath the River Thames, and it is, the size of it is, I don't know how many double-decker buses you can fit in it, but, you know, lots of them. Now, it's exciting in that respect. Also, by the way, it hasn't really run especially over budget. It looks like it's going to open on time. What's slightly less exciting about it is you're kind of just making a bigger tank to deal with the deficiencies of the system that we chose 170 years ago. It is essentially just not even making good, but making a little bit less bad some of the problems that we have at the moment with sewage overflows. And even when that Tideway tunnel is in operation, it won't eliminate all of the sewage overflows in London. You'll still have, it eliminates maybe 95% of them. So you'll still have sewage overflows. And so I suppose that's what's a little disappointing about it, is it's not trying to rethink the nature of how we do sewage.
Ed's full report, by the way, is on the Sky News YouTube page, so go and have a look at that. Ed, thank you so much. As I said, I never thought I'd get so much pleasure talking to you about poo and
Now
we,
you know.
and now I know. Thank you so much.
Thank you.